an independent nation is an amazing and interesting story. So when I arrived at the National Archives, I walked slowly into the rotunda of the Charters of Freedom, as though I were walking into a particularly sacred space. There were people scattered around the room, but it wasn't terribly busy. And next to each of the display cases stood a person with a radio clip to their belt. I immediately understood that they were guarding the documents. Despite the fact that each document was protected by almost half an inch of bulletproof glass, I walked slowly into the room, looking first at everything but the documents, savoring the moment when I would stand there before them. Finally, I came to a stop before the Declaration, because it came first. I was awestruck, being so close to those actual words. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Sounds a little like the inherent worth and dignity of every person. I scanned the documents that the colonists used to propel their land to war with their own government. I reflected on how words can both create and destroy. The Declaration ended a relationship with their home. These people were British citizens, and they were starting a war. They knew people would die, even as they hoped they would create something new. After considering the weight of history in front of me for several minutes, I moved on to the Constitution, aware that I couldn't stand there all day thinking about the American Revolution. And it was when I stood in front of the Constitution that I cried. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America, the birth of a nation. These words mattered to me. They are a dream, a hope given form. And it was only after their first failed experiment of the Articles of the Confederation that the infant government came up with this document. It was supposed to be the end of the struggle, even as it was born from struggle of so very many committee meetings. The board might be relieved to know their committee meetings went on for days, while ours only go a couple of hours. In their defense, we aren't trying to create a country, and in our defense, we actually enjoy talking to each other. Eventually, I left the National Archives and DC and returned to Indiana, where I was living at the time. And as one does these days, I reflected on my experience on Facebook. I posted about seeing these world-changing documents and about crying over them. The first response was from a friend who is Black. She said, "I cried too, for much different reasons." And I got it. As I had reflected on the truths I knew about our history and about our ideals our nation's founders were reaching for in that document, a desire to form a more perfect union and establish justice, I hadn't stopped in that moment to reflect on the truth I also knew to be present in that document. Later on, we declared that people who had been enslaved by this country would be counted as 3/5 a person. Our founding documents included the acceptance of slavery. She had cried too, for much different reasons. My friend and I approached these documents with two different stories in our hearts, born from two very different experiences of living in America. The history I had internalized was incomplete. As I mentioned before, I love the stories we tell ourselves. I think the stories that we tell about who we are point us in the direction of people that we hope we can be. But what if many of those stories are based on ignoring uncomfortable truths? If our stories about ourselves are supposed to point us in the direction of who we want to be, what happens if we start so far away from reality? What if the truth of our beginning as a country started over a century and a half before those founding documents were written? What if our history doesn't begin 243 years ago in 1776, but instead requires looking back 400 years? How many of you have read or heard about the 1619 Project? A couple of you. The 1619 Project is a collection of documents that opens like this. In August of 1619, a ship appeared on this horizon, and there's a picture, near Point Comfort, a coastal port in the British colony of Virginia. It carried more than 20 enslaved Africans who were sold to the colonists. America was not yet America, but this was the moment it began. No aspect of the country that would be formed here has been untouched by the 250 years of slavery that followed. On the 400th anniversary of this fateful moment, it is finally time to tell our story truthfully. The project goes on to explore a variety of essays that cover such diverse areas as the link between institutionalized racism and the lack of universal health care in this country, to how traffic problems in Atlanta are directly connected to this country's history of racial housing segregation. The project includes poems, written essays, and a photo series. It's powerful and painful, showing that not only was this country founded with slavery, but it was founded on slavery. And that fact continues to impact each of us today in ways we expect and in so many that we don't. She had cried too, for very different reasons. It's rough, my friends. How do we balance the reality of our past with who we want to become? One of the things I've always loved about this country is that we reach towards such high ideals. We reach for justice and liberty. We strive for freedom for all. And when the developers of the Constitution wrote the framework for this country, many of them were slave owners. The 1619 Project suggests that the only reason the framers thought they could win the war was because of the economy of slavery. Think about that. Are the actions and behaviors of these people excused by the times they were living in? Of course not. Morality is not relative to a particular time period. And do their actions invalidate their words? Ultimately, I think we each need to consider that question for ourselves. But here's where I am on it now. I believe the words of justice and freedom in the Constitution and the Declaration were always aspirational. Our plan to create justice and secure the blessings of liberty has always been challenged by the realities that we are human. So does that mean we just disregard the ideal? When we look at children being locked up and families being ripped apart at our border, when we hear about indigenous communities being taken advantage of, when we read the 1619 Project and learn about some of the realities of slavery and its continuing impact on our lives, do we just tell ourselves this is who we are and who we have always been? Do we push down the guilt and shame? Do we try to ignore it and listen only to the stories that make us feel good? When I chose today's sermon title, Building the Welcome Table, I had planned to do something easier. Today is Bring a Friend Sunday here at East Liberty, and Bring a Friend Sunday usually includes something lighthearted and inviting. I had planned to welcome our guests and members by talking about how Unitarian Universalism is built on a foundation of including diverse people and ideas. I had a lovely, nice sermon in mind for you all. But let's be honest. When has Unitarian Universalism ever been an easy faith? Our progressive religious tradition, as well as our Universalist and Unitarian history, have instilled in us the moral call and responsibility to welcome people, yes, and to give them a place at the table both in our churches and in our country. But that welcome isn't some sweet nicety that includes avoiding tough topics or pretending we have already reached our ideals. So I couldn't just ignore this important 1619 anniversary. So what does our welcome table look like in light of the systems of oppression such as racism? When I picture a welcoming table, I imagine a large, beautiful structure made of redwood, because I think that wood's beautiful. It's a sturdy table with a tablecloth and elegant candles. There are strong, comfortable chairs all around it, just waiting to be filled. And it extends as far as the eye can see. But what I realized as I considered the implications of the 1619 project is that the beautiful, expansive table I had pictured in my mind was incomplete. When a person of color looks at that table, what do they see? When an immigrant released from detention or granted asylum looks at that table, what do they see? When a person marginalized by ability, gender, sexual orientation, or social class looks at that table, what do they see? She had cried too, for much different reasons. How can I invite people to the table when the beautiful redwood structure that I had imagined looks so very different and so much more damaged to others? Perhaps it's time to rebuild the table. Maybe instead of inviting others to our table, we need to consider what it would look like if we built that new table together. Now, this is harder than it seems. I love the table we already have. I've been sitting at it most of my life, listening to skewed but familiar stories and enjoying a sense of familiarity and belonging. It's important that I acknowledge what I'm giving up, as well as what I'm gaining. If we rebuild the welcome table, it may not feel the same as it used to. As we learn the truth about our histories, as we learn who we have been and the actions we have taken as a nation, I can't promise you it won't hurt. I remember the first time I heard about the Japanese internment camps during World War II. I was in high school. I felt betrayed by the stories I had always been told. We were supposed to have been the good guys in that war. I felt betrayed by my teachers and by my textbooks. I didn't learn it from my textbooks. But at the same time, it opened me up in a different way. I finally began to understand that there were stories I wasn't being told. There were people and perspectives that I couldn't comprehend because I had always been told that this, over here, is our entire truth, when really it was this over here and this over here and some of this up here. After the initial surprise, I found this freeing, challenging, and exciting. This, my friends, is the hope that I have to offer you today. If we rebuild the welcome table with a wider truth, it might not look the same as it did before. There might be a blend of woods. The chairs might come in different shapes and different sizes. The stories we share over the table might be more complex. And some may not have a simple moral or a tidy ending. Over time, together at the table, we will see food stains and chips and the occasional leg that we have to replace with a different one. This is the reality of a welcome table. That table I described earlier, it never really existed anywhere but in my imagination. Sure, it was picture perfect, but it wasn't real, and it certainly wasn't a welcome table that reflects our values as Unitarian Universalists. Rebuilding our idea of a welcome table will require us to fully acknowledge who we have been, who we are, and who we want to be. It will require hearing stories that are uncomfortable and challenging, and to challenge our understanding of ourselves and each other. What if this is what is needed to truly welcome everyone to the table? Would it be worth it then? Yes, the answer is yes. Remember at the beginning when I told you that I love the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and who we hope to become? Imagine who we might become if the stories we tell ourselves around this newly forming welcome table are grounded in truth. If we aspire to be a place of freedom and justice, and we acknowledge the ways we have failed as well as our desire to do better. When I told the story this morning about breaking my mother's candle, I didn't tell you the complete ending. My parents ended up deciding to not really punish me for breaking the rules because I'd already punished myself so thoroughly. My sister wasn't happy about this consequence. And when I told the truth, when I faced whatever the consequences would be, I freed myself to move forward. When we tell ourselves the truth of who we have been, we free ourselves to figure out who we are and who we want to become. It feels good to tell the truth. Today, across the United States, churches are joining together to do just that. As part of the 1619 Project, we've been invited to ring the bells at 3 p.m. in remembrance of the first enslaved Africans brought to our country 400 years ago. Virginia and I will be here at 3 p.m. to ring the bells of the Universalist Unitarian Church of East Liberty for 1 minute. Please feel free to join us if you can. If you're unable to come back here at this time, perhaps set a reminder alarm on your cell phone and take 1 minute for reflection at 3, wherever you might be. The 1619 remembrance is an opportunity to remember, lament, and repent. But it's not simply about feeling bad. When we acknowledge our mistakes that harmed and killed people hundreds of years ago and that continue to affect the lives of people today, yes, we will feel uncomfortable. But the discomfort is a result of our high ideals we recognize we haven't lived up to yet. If we didn't have any sense of how we might be better, we wouldn't feel any discomfort at all. In that sense, perhaps my friend and I were crying for the same reasons when we viewed this nation's founding documents. We both cried at the awesomeness of our ideals. My friend, however, deeply recognized how far from those ideals we were, even when they were first penned. My beloved spiritual companions, there is so very much to love about this congregation, this community, and this nation. Our ideals and aspirations are worthy of our time and our energy. It's why we join in this work. It's why we protest. It's why we send letters to politicians and letters to the editor. It's why we vote. Because it takes time, energy, and attention to reach for our highest goals. We can build the welcome table together, and we can tell the truth as we sit at it alongside others. Make it so. Amen. Blessed be.